Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Horus, Primarch of the Lunarwolves Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. Let us begin, as we always do, at the beginning. Long before the wars that would scar the galaxy from end to end. Long before the betrayal that turned brother against brother, and long before the name Horus became a word spoken only in anger or in grief, there was simply a child. Not born in the way that ordinary men and women are born, but made, deep within hidden laboratories on ancient Terra, in an age when the Emperor of mankind still dreamed of a galaxy united beneath a single banner of reason and strength. It is a quiet thought to settle into, that even the most fearsome names in this long and tragic history began as something small, something unfinished, something waiting patiently to be shaped by the world that would eventually claim it. Let yourself sink a little further into this thought, here at the very outset of so long a story. Every name that history remembers, whether with reverence or with sorrow, once belonged to something newly made, untested, uncertain of what lay ahead. There is a particular comfort in remembering this, even as the tale that follows grows darker with every passing hour. Before legend, there is simply beginning. Before tragedy, there is simply a child, waiting quietly in the dark for the galaxy to find him. Horus Lupercal was one of the Primarchs, 20 of them in total, brought into being by the Emperor as the perfect commanders of his great and ambitious crusade. Each was designed to be extraordinary, possessed of strength beyond mortal men, and cunning sharper than any blade ever forged. Each was meant to stand at the head of a Space Marine legion, carrying the Emperor's vision out into the dark and unmapped spaces between the stars. Horus was, in the very beginning, simply one thread among these 20, woven from the same careful design, sharing in the same vast and uncertain purpose as his brothers. There was nothing yet to suggest the heights he would one day climb, nor the terrible depths to which he would eventually fall. He was, for a time, only potential, only promise. A single unfinished verse within a much longer and stranger song. And yet, even at the very start, there was something that seemed to set him apart from the others. Some records, fragmentary and uncertain as so much from that distant era remains, suggest that Horus may have been the very first Primarch ever brought into being upon Terra itself. The first spark of that great undertaking. The first vessel built to hold the Emperor's ambitions. If this is true, then there is a quiet, almost mournful poetry to it. That the one who would one day rise highest among his brothers, and fall furthest from grace, was also the very first of them all to draw breath. The first attempt at something close to perfection, in a long and careful project that would, in the end, prove far from perfect at all. A beginning, perhaps, that already carried within it the shape of an ending. This early beginning, however, did not last. Like all of his brothers, Horus was taken from the place of his creation and cast out into the vastness of the galaxy, scattered as a defenseless infant by forces that remain, even now, only half understood by those who study these ancient records. We do not know the full truth of how, or why, this dispersal happened. Only that it did, and that it sent 20 fragile sleeping children drifting alone through the endless and silent dark, each one bound for a different world, a different fate, a different shaping of the soul that would one day awaken inside them. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this thought, to imagine that long and silent drift through the void. No light to guide the way. No voice to offer comfort. Only the slow patient turning of distant stars outside a small and fragile vessel, carrying something far greater than it could possibly have known, deeper into the waiting dark. 20 separate destinies, each one entirely unknown to the others in that moment, drifting outward like seeds scattered upon some vast and silent wind. None of the 20 knew, in that long and lightless passage, what world awaited them, nor what manner of life would shape the being they were destined to become. It is a strange thing to consider, how much of what later seemed so inevitable about each Primarch's character began, in truth, as nothing more than chance, a pod drifting toward one world rather than another, entirely beyond anyone's control or design. Horus's gestation pod, smaller than the endless void surrounding it and just as silent, eventually came to rest upon Cthonia, a hive world lying close to Terra in the wider scheme of the galaxy, though close in the way that a blade rests close against an exposed throat. Cthonia offered no warmth, no welcome, no gentle cradle of comfort for the child who had fallen so quietly into its keeping. It was a place of choking industry and ceaseless noise, of endless grey towers rising into smog-filled skies that never once cleared to reveal the stars above. Beneath those towers ran tunnels within tunnels, deep and winding passages where light rarely reached, and where silence, even in the deepest hours, was never truly silent. It was, in every sense that mattered, a world built entirely upon survival, where the strong endured simply by outlasting the weak around them, and where kindness was a currency so rare that few ever thought to spend it. Picture, if you can, the moment such a pod might have settled at last against unfamiliar ground, far from the bright halls of its making. No fanfare greeted its arrival. No gathering of scholars or soldiers stood waiting to receive what lay within. Only the slow, indifferent grind of a hive world's endless machinery, continuing exactly as it always had, utterly unaware that something extraordinary had just been delivered into its keeping. Cthonia would not pause to notice him. It would simply absorb him, as it absorbed everything, into its vast and unforgiving rhythm. It was here, in this unforgiving and unyielding place, that Horus spent the whole of his youth, growing not beneath open skies but within the close suffocating dark of the underhive itself. The world shaped him slowly, the way patient water shapes even the hardest stone, wearing away anything soft, anything yielding, until only the hard and the necessary remained beneath the surface. He learned, in those long early years, that mercy was a luxury few around him could ever afford, and that trust was a currency easily offered yet rarely returned in kind. Independence became his shield against a world that offered no protection of its own. Self-reliance became the very foundation upon which everything else was built. In a place that asked everything of its children and promised nothing in return, Horus learned early to expect little from others, and to rely instead upon the strength of his own two hands, and the quiet, careful sharpness of his own mind. There would have been no slow mornings in such a childhood, no idle hours spent simply watching the world go by. Every day on Cthonia asked something of the boy who would become Horus, and every day, in turn, he answered. The air itself in the deep underhive carried the taste of rust and old smoke, thick enough to settle on the tongue, and the only light most children knew came from flickering strip lamps strung along corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, twisting downward into levels older and darker than the ones above. In such a place, growing up quickly was not a misfortune. It was simply the only way to grow up at all. And so Horus did, faster perhaps than nature ever intended, hardening into someone capable, long before he was fully grown. The violence of Cthonia was never incidental to his upbringing. It was woven into the very fabric of his earliest years, as natural and constant as the smog above the towers. Gang culture ruled the underhive in those distant days, factions rising and falling like slow restless tides in the dark, each one fighting not for glory or honor, but simply for the right to see another day. Horus came of age within this shifting world of fragile alliances and sudden betrayals, learning the harsh arithmetic of survival, long before he ever learned to read the patterns of the stars above. He watched alliances form out of desperation, and dissolve, just as quickly, into blood and silence. He learned that loyalty, when it was real and freely given, was worth more than any treasure the underhive could ever offer. And he learned, too, that betrayal, when it finally came swiftly, and almost always without warning. These were lessons written not in books or lessons taught by gentle tutors, but in scars, and in memory, and they remained with him for the whole of his long and extraordinary life. It is worth lingering a moment longer on what such a childhood truly meant. To grow among gangs is to learn, very early, that a man's worth is measured by what he can offer to those around him, and by nothing else. There is no inheritance in the underhive, no family name to soften a hard fall. There is only the next decision, made quickly, and the next test of strength or wit that follows close behind it. Horus came to understand the underhive, not as a place of chaos, but as a place with its own quiet logic, its own unspoken rules, harsh though they were. And within that logic, he found he could move with a kind of ease that few others seemed to manage, reading the currents of loyalty and threat around him, the way a sailor might read the wind. Some accounts, passed down through fragments and whispers rather than any certain record, claim that the boy who would one day become Horus was known then by another name entirely. Nergui, they call him, in these older half-forgotten tellings, a name carried quietly through the underhive gangs like a secret too valuable to share with strangers. We cannot know now how much truth lies hidden within this name, nor what it might once have meant to the boy who carried it through those long dark years. But there is something fitting in the idea that greatness so often begins anonymously, hidden beneath names that history later forgets entirely, waiting patiently, quietly, for the moment it might finally be revealed to a wider and far less forgiving galaxy. Names, after all, are simply labels given by others, useful for a time and then quietly set aside when circumstance demands something new. Whatever he was called in those early years upon Cthonia, the boy beneath the name remained the same, gathering strength and patience in equal measure, waiting for the moment when a different name entirely would carry him out across the stars. Other records speak instead of a gang lord named Cthonia, a hard and dangerous figure said to have taken the strange unnaturally strong child beneath his uncertain protection. If this account holds any truth at all, then Cthonia raised the boy, not with tenderness or warmth, but with the same brutal pragmatism that Cthonia demanded of every one of its sons. There would have been no gentle words offered in such an upbringing, no soft lessons learned beside a warm and welcoming hearth. Only the cold clarity of survival, taught patiently through harsh example, through grim necessity, through the simple, unspoken understanding that weakness on Cthonia was rarely forgiven, and even less often given a second, gentler chance to prove itself. It was here too, amid the gang wars and shifting loyalties of the underhive, that the symbol which would follow Horus for the entire rest of his long life first quietly took root within him. The wolf. Not chosen idly, nor for simple decoration, but drawn directly from the very culture that had shaped him from infancy. The wolf was an emblem of survival among ruins, a creature that hunted patiently in darkness and answered to no master but its own pack, relying on cunning every bit as much as raw strength, and on loyalty to its own kind above almost everything else. Horus carried this quiet symbol forward into every later stage of his long and remarkable life, and in time, it became utterly inseparable from his name, and from the great legion he would one day come to lead among the endless stars. There is something worth dwelling on in this choice of symbol, gentle as it may seem against the harder facts of his upbringing. A wolf does not rule alone. It moves within a pack, bound by loyalty as much as by blood, trusting those beside it even as it remains, always, watchful of the dark beyond the firelight. Perhaps this is what Horus carried forward most truly from Cthonia. Not simply ruthlessness, nor simply cunning, but a deep and abiding understanding of what it meant to belong to something larger than himself, and what it cost when that belonging was ever broken. The marks of Cthonia never fully left him, no matter how far he eventually traveled, nor how high he eventually rose above the world of his birth. Even in later years, when he walked the marble halls of terror itself, and stood as trusted confidant to kings and commanders alike, there remained in his voice the unmistakable cadence of the underhive. An accent shaped not by quiet courts or careful academies, but by lower castes and harder streets, by long years spent speaking quickly, and quietly, in the dark. In his manner too, there lingered always a certain roughness, an honesty of bearing that no amount of careful courtly polish could ever entirely smooth away. It was, in its own strange and quiet way, a kind of lasting truth that he carried with him wherever he went. A constant, gentle reminder of exactly where he had come from, even as the wider galaxy slowly began to call him by far greater and far grander names. Those who met him in later years often remarked upon this quality before they could quite name it. There was a warmth to the way he spoke, an easy familiarity that put soldiers and commanders alike at their ease, yet beneath that warmth ran something unmistakably forged rather than born. It was the voice of someone who had once needed to be believed quickly, and trusted completely, simply to see another sunrise. Even surrounded by the grandeur of terror, with its towers of marble and its endless ceremony, Horus never quite lost the cadence of a boy who had learned to speak first with his fists, and only afterwards with his words. It was this long and often brutal childhood, this slow and patient forging within the depths of a hive world that asked everything of its children and offered almost nothing in return, that shaped the deeper qualities for which Horus would one day become known across 1,000 distant worlds. His ruthlessness, sharpened patiently upon the endless edge of necessity. His adaptability, born from a childhood where the rules of survival shifted as often, and as suddenly, as the restless tides of gang war themselves. These were not gifts handed to him freely by the careful design of his creation alone. They were earned, slowly and painfully, in the dark, on a world that demanded everything of him, and forgave almost nothing in return. It is tempting, looking back across the long arc of his life, to wonder how much of what came later was already present in those early years beneath Chthonia's smog-filled skies. The same charm that won him gangs of followers in the Underhive would, in time, win him entire legions. The same sharp instinct for shifting loyalty, learned among rival factions fighting over scraps of territory, would later serve him well in councils far grander than any Underhive gathering. And the same hard, unsentimental willingness to do whatever survival required, first learned as a boy with nothing, would one day shape decisions that altered the course of the entire galaxy. Cthonia did not simply raise a child. It quietly authored the instincts of the man that child would become. There is a particular stillness worth dwelling on. Picture, if you will, the deep Underhive in its rare moments of quiet, those brief hours when even the gangs and the machinery seemed to pause, and a young boy might have found, somewhere in the dark, a corner of relative peace to simply rest. Cthonia rarely offered such moments, but it offered them occasionally, and perhaps it was in these scattered fragments of calm that Horus first learned the value of stillness amid chaos, a skill that would serve him well across the long centuries still ahead of him. Even hard worlds, it seems, leave room for small mercies, however briefly they may last. And perhaps, in some quiet way, it is fitting that a story which began in darkness and difficulty should also remind us that rest, however hard won, remains possible even amid the harshest of circumstances. Let that thought settle now, gently, as the Underhive fades slowly from view, and the wider galaxy begins, at last, to open itself before him. And so, before he ever wore the mantle of Warmaster, before he ever stood as the most beloved and most trusted of all his many brothers, Horus Lupercal was simply a child of Cthonia. A survivor among countless other survivors. A wolf among wolves, learning the shape of the world with his own two hands and his own quiet wit, long before he ever learned to shape worlds of his own. Let this image settle now, as the rest of his story slowly begins to unfold. A boy in the dark, learning patiently to endure, long before the wider galaxy ever learned his name. Rediscovery and reunion with the Emperor. Every story of separation, if it is allowed to run its course for long enough, eventually finds its way back towards a moment of return. For Horus, that moment came earlier than it did for almost any of his brothers. Among the scattered Primarchs, each lost to a different corner of the galaxy and a different fate, Horus was among the very first to be found again by the Emperor himself, and in many of the older accounts, he is remembered as the very first of all. The first to be lost, by some tellings, and now the first to be found. There is a certain symmetry in that, a sense of a story folding gently back upon itself, as so many of the oldest stories eventually do. There is a gentle rhythm to stories told this way, loss followed eventually by return, separation followed eventually by reunion. It is one of the oldest patterns in any tale worth telling, and perhaps it is comforting, even now, to know that this particular thread of the story bends, at least for a time, towards something hopeful. Think for a moment of what such a reunion might have felt like after so many years spent apart. The Emperor, having lost his sons to the unknown reaches of the galaxy without ever truly knowing where each one had landed, now found himself standing before the very first proof that his great endeavor might yet succeed. Whatever words passed between them in that first quiet moment have not survived in any record we possess. Perhaps none were needed. Perhaps recognition itself was enough, two beings who shared something deeper than blood, meeting at last across the gulf that had separated them for so long. He was not found waiting quietly, nor was he found in need of rescue. Some of the stories that have come down to us describe something far more striking, a young man already standing at the head of a revolutionary force upon Cthonia itself, already reshaping the brutal world of his upbringing, through sheer force of will alone. If this account is true, then the Emperor did not arrive to save a lost child from the dark. He arrived instead to find someone who had already begun, quite without guidance, to bend an entire world towards his own purpose. It is a remarkable thought to rest upon. That before any crusade, before any legion, Horus had already shown the first unmistakable signs of the leader he was destined to become. There is a quiet wonder in this particular detail, however the truth of it may be weighed against other accounts. A child abandoned to the harshest of worlds, given no guidance, no instruction, no example beyond what the Underhive itself provided, and yet somehow finding within himself the capacity to lead, to inspire, to reshape an entire world before his own father ever arrived to claim him. Imagine the Underhive of Cthonia, that same world of rust and shadow described before, now slowly turning beneath the will of a single young man who refused simply to survive within it. Where once there had been only rival gangs and shifting loyalties, something closer to order, however rough, had begun to take its place. Old grievances were set aside. Scattered factions found themselves drawn together, not by force alone, but by the quiet, magnetic certainty of someone who seemed to know, even then, exactly where he was leading them. It is little wonder that when the Emperor finally arrived, he did not find a boy at all, but something closer to a leader already fully formed. Whatever the precise truth of that meeting may have been, what followed it is remembered with far greater certainty. Horus knelt, by every account that survives, and swore his fealty to the Emperor openly, before all who had gathered to witness it. There was no hesitation recorded in this moment, no reluctance held back behind careful words. It was a public and total surrender of one purpose into another, the gang leader of Cthonia setting aside the world he had built in the Underhive, in order to take up a far greater calling beneath his father's banner. It is worth imagining the weight of that moment, a young man who had spent his entire life trusting only himself, choosing, at last, to place that trust somewhere outside his own hands. There is something quietly moving in the image of that single kneeling figure, surrounded by followers who had only ever known him as their leader, now bowing his own head before someone greater still. For a boy raised to believe that strength alone determined who led and who followed, this was perhaps the truest test he had yet faced. Not a battle, not a negotiation, but a willing submission, offered freely rather than extracted by force. That he gave it so completely, and without recorded hesitation, tells us something important about the kind of son the Emperor had found in him. From that day onward, Horus rose quickly within his father's favor, becoming, in a remarkably short span of time, one of the most trusted of all the Emperor's many sons. This was no small thing among Primarchs as gifted and as proud as these. Each of the 20 carried within him the seeds of greatness, yet it was Horus who seemed, again and again, to step most naturally into the role the Emperor required of him. Where some of his brothers held themselves at a careful distance, weighing every command before they accepted it, Horus offered his loyalty freely, and in turn, received a closeness that few others were ever granted. This was not favoritism born of simple convenience, nor a closeness granted lightly. The Emperor had created 20 sons specifically to be exceptional, and exceptional men do not yield their trust, nor earn the trust of others, without good cause. What Horus offered was something subtler than mere obedience. He brought with him an instinct for reading those around him, a skill honed across years spent navigating the treacherous loyalties of Cthonia, and this same skill now served him in reading the Emperor himself, understanding what was needed before it was ever asked, and delivering it without complaint or hesitation. For long years afterward, Horus campaigned directly at his father's side, marching alongside the Emperor himself through the early formative years of the Great Crusade. This was a privilege granted to no other Primarch in quite the same enduring way. While his brothers were given worlds and legions of their own to command from afar, Horus remained close to the source of it all, learning at first hand the strategies and the burdens that came with carrying the Emperor's great vision out across the stars. It is easy, in the quiet of hindsight, to imagine how deeply such years must have shaped him, walking always in the shadow of the one being in the galaxy he trusted absolutely. Picture those campaigns now, slowly, as one might picture an old and treasured memory. Endless void crossings between one conquered system and the next. Long councils held in the dim light of command chambers, father and son leaning over star charts together, planning the slow, patient expansion of an imperium still finding its shape. Battles fought side by side, where the Emperor's strategy met Horus's instinct, each sharpening the other across years of shared trial. Few sons, in any age, are given so long and so close an apprenticeship beside someone they so completely admire. This closeness, in time, grew into something rarer still. Some of the older sources describe Horus, during those long early years, as the Emperor's only gene-son in any practical sense, the one Primarch who stood beside his father while the others remained scattered, still waiting to be found across the dark expanse of the galaxy. Whether or not this was strictly true in every account, the sentiment behind it endures clearly enough. For a great span of years, it was Horus alone who walked beside the Emperor as both son and trusted companion, and it was this singular bond that set him apart, long before any title or honor was ever bestowed upon him. There is a quiet loneliness embedded within that distinction, if one allows oneself to consider it fully. To be the only son present, for years on end, while 19 brothers remained lost somewhere among the stars, must have placed Horus in a position unlike any other being in the galaxy. He alone knew, for a time, what it meant to be raised in his father's direct presence, to be shaped not by a hive-world or a jungle moon, but by the Emperor's own teaching, offered patiently and at close range. Whatever else might be said of him in the dark chapters still to come, those early years beside his father were, by every surviving account, years of genuine warmth between them. Out of this closeness emerged something larger than simple favoritism. Horus became, in effect, the very prototype of what a Primarch was meant to be. Not merely a brilliant commander, nor merely a devoted son, but something rarer still, a bridge standing firmly between the Emperor's distant vision and the many brothers who would, in time, follow in his footsteps. He understood, in a way few others quite managed, how to translate his father's will into something his brothers could follow without resentment, and how to carry the weight of command without ever losing the loyalty of those beneath him. This bridging quality would prove, in the long run, to be perhaps the most important role Horus ever held, more important even than any single victory won upon any single battlefield. A galaxy of brilliant, proud, and fiercely independent Primarchs could easily have fractured under the weight of its own ambition, each brother pulling in his own direction, certain of his own correctness. That this did not happen, not for many long years, owed a great deal to the quiet, steady example Horus offered. He showed his brothers, simply by the manner of his own conduct, what devotion to their father's cause could look like, without ever demanding that devotion be expressed in only one way. It is worth lingering a moment longer on what made this particular role so difficult to fill, and so easy, in hindsight, to underestimate. Many beings can lead through strength alone, commanding obedience through simple force of will or weight of arms. Far fewer can lead through example, earning the quiet imitation of brothers who answered to no one but their father, and who might easily have resented any suggestion that one among them deserved to be followed more closely than the rest. Horus achieved this not through demand, but through the simple, patient accumulation of trust, campaign after campaign, council after council, until his example had become, almost without anyone quite noticing how it happened, the unspoken standard against which the wider Imperium measured devotion itself. It was this very quality that made him so essential as more of his lost brothers were gradually found and brought home across the years that followed. As each new Primarch emerged, blinking, into the wider Imperium, it was often Horus who stood ready to guide them, helping ease their passage into the great hierarchy the Emperor had built. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to step suddenly from one world into another, having lived through that very transformation himself. In this quiet, steady work of integration, as much as in any battle fought beneath his banner, Horus proved himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him from that very first fateful meeting on Cthonia. Consider how disorienting such a reunion must have felt for each newly found brother in turn. To wake, in effect, into a galaxy already half-built, already shaped by decisions made in their long absence, surrounded by other Primarchs whose temperaments and histories were entirely unknown. Horus became, in these moments, something like a steady hand extended across that unfamiliar threshold. He had walked this exact path himself, and he never seemed to forget it. Whether welcoming a brother as fierce as Magnus or as quiet and dutiful as others among them, Horus offered the same patient understanding each time, easing them gently towards the place they were meant to take among their father's sons. The Master of the Lunarwolves. Every Primarch, once found and welcomed into the Imperium, was given a legion of his own to command, and for Horus, that legion was the 16th, known to history as the Lunarwolves. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the shape of his character would be expressed most fully, not through words or counsels, but through the warriors who would carry his name into battle across 1,000 worlds. A legion is more than an army. It is an extension of the will of the one who leads it, and from the very first days of his command, Horus began to remake the Lunarwolves entirely in his own image. A name carries its own quiet weight. The Lunarwolves, named for the pale moon that watches silently over terror itself, suggested from the very outset something distant yet watchful, something that hunted in shadow while remaining bound, always, to the world it circled. It was a fitting name for a legion that would, in time, grow as close to its Primarch as any family bound by blood, circling always around the gravity of the one being who had shaped them so completely. There is something worth pausing on, in the quiet of this thought, about what it means for a single being to become so completely entwined with tens of thousands of warriors spread across the stars. A legion was vast beyond easy imagining, a force capable of conquering entire systems, and yet within it, every soldier still looked, in some fashion, towards the example of a single Primarch for guidance. Horus understood this responsibility from the very beginning, and rather than ruling from a distance, he chose instead to walk among his warriors, to know them, and to let them know him in turn. It was no accident perhaps, that this legion drew so heavily from the world of his own upbringing. Cthonia provided a great many of the recruits who would go on to fill the ranks of the Lunar Wolves, and in this shared origin there grew a bond between Primarch and Legion that few other forces in the Imperium could claim. These were not simply soldiers following a commander from some distant, unfamiliar background. They were, in a very real sense, sons of the same hard world that had shaped Horus himself, carrying within them the same hard-won instincts for survival, loyalty, and quiet ruthlessness that had once carried a boy through the Underhive. For these recruits, serving beneath Horus was never quite like serving beneath a stranger, however vast and however godlike his stature had become. There was a recognition there, unspoken but deeply felt, between a Primarch who had once crawled through the same rusted corridors they themselves had known, and the warriors who now stood beside him beneath a very different sky. He spoke their language before he ever spoke a word, understanding instinctively the particular toughness that Cthonia bred into its sons, and this shared understanding became the quiet foundation upon which the entire legion was built. It is worth remembering too, that recruitment from a single world is never a simple administrative matter. It shapes the very temperament of a fighting force, carrying forward customs and unspoken codes that no amount of imperial training could ever fully erase, nor would Horus have wished it otherwise. The dialects of the Underhive echoed faintly through the corridors of his warships. Old gestures of respect, learned first among rival gangs fighting for scraps of territory, found new expression in the salutes and customs of the Legion. In this way, Cthonia itself traveled outward across the stars, carried within the bones of every warrior who wore the colors of the 16th. This shared origin showed itself most clearly on the battlefield, where the Lunar Wolves earned a reputation that soon outpaced even the most celebrated of their brother legions. They became known, across 100 campaigns, for warfare that was decisive almost to the point of being merciless, never lingering where a swift and total victory might be claimed instead. There was little patience among the Lunar Wolves for slow sieges or cautious maneuver. They struck hard, and they struck quickly, trusting always in the momentum of the first overwhelming blow, to settle a battle before their enemy had even fully understood what had begun. It is worth letting this image settle. The swift, decisive nature of these warriors carried forward from a world that had never permitted hesitation. Every gang war fought upon Cthonia had taught the same lesson in miniature that the Lunar Wolves now carried out across entire star systems. That decisive action, taken quickly and without wavering, saved more lives in the long run than caution ever could. Other legions, in time, came to recognize the particular signature of a Lunar Wolves campaign almost before the official reports arrived. A world that had stood defiant one season would often fall within weeks of their arrival, not through prolonged attrition, but through a single, overwhelming application of force that left little room for an enemy to recover. This reputation traveled ahead of them across the stars, and there were those who claimed that some worlds chose surrender before a single shot was fired, simply upon hearing that the 16th Legion approached, carrying with it the name of Horus Lupercal. Beneath this reputation lay a combat doctrine built carefully around the instincts of Cthonia itself. The Lunar Wolves fought not as isolated soldiers but as something closer to a pack, coordinating with an instinctive trust that echoed the gang culture of the Underhive from which so many of them had come. Shock assaults formed the heart of their approach. Sudden and overwhelming strikes designed to break an enemy's will, before their lines could ever properly form. Momentum, once gained, was never surrendered. Every commander beneath Horus understood that hesitation cost more lives than boldness ever could, and the Legion's tactics reflected this lesson in every engagement they fought. This pack-based coordination was not simply a matter of tactics drilled into soldiers from above. It grew, instead, from something closer to instinct, the same instinct that had once allowed rival gangs on Cthonia to read one another's movements in the dark without need for spoken word. Squads moved as though sensing one another's intentions before they were given, flanking and pressing forward in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, though no such rigid choreography existed. It was simply the natural rhythm of warriors who trusted one another absolutely, applied now on a scale that spanned entire star systems rather than a few city blocks. What held this fierce and aggressive force together, however, was not doctrine alone. It was Horus himself, and the particular quality of loyalty he seemed able to draw from every warrior who served beneath him. This was not the simple obedience that any commander might expect from disciplined troops. It ran deeper than that, closer to devotion, the kind of loyalty a man offers willingly rather than under compulsion. His warriors did not merely follow his orders. They followed him, trusting his judgment in a way that went beyond rank or hierarchy, the same way the gangs of Cthonia had once trusted the instincts of a leader who never seemed to falter. This devotion expressed itself in countless small moments that rarely found their way into official record, yet shaped the legion just as surely as any battle ever did. Warriors spoke of him not with the careful formality reserved for distant commanders, but with the easy warmth one might use for a brother in arms. He remembered names. He remembered small kindnesses owed and small debts repaid. In the quiet hours between campaigns, he was as likely to be found sharing a meal among ordinary soldiers as presiding over some grand council, and it was this accessibility, as much as any victory in battle, that bound his legion to him so completely. Over time, this devotion reshaped the legion's very culture, until it became difficult to separate the identity of the Lunarwolves from the personal example set by their Primarch. New recruits absorbed his manner and his bearing as readily as they absorbed his tactics, and veterans spoke of him with a reverence that bordered on something almost mythic. It was a culture built not around abstract ideals, but around a living example, a Primarch who fought beside his men, who shared their hardships, and who never asked of them anything he was not equally willing to give himself. This was, in its own quiet way, a rare achievement among the great legions of the Crusade. Some of his brothers ruled through doctrine, codifying their philosophy into texts and creeds that their warriors studied and recited. Horus required no such formal instruction. His example alone proved sufficient, passed down not through scripture but through observation, captain teaching sergeant, sergeant teaching the newest recruit, each one learning by watching how their Primarch carried himself in victory and in hardship alike. In this way, the culture of the Lunarwolves remained remarkably consistent across thousands of warriors and dozens of campaigns, bound together not by written law, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to fight as Horus fought, and to lead as Horus led. There is something worth resting on in this particular method of leadership, this slow transmission of culture through example, rather than decree. It asks more of the one who leads, for there can be no hiding behind written law when the standard is one's own conduct, observed daily by thousands of watchful eyes. Yet it also builds something sturdier than mere obedience to rule, a living tradition carried forward in the small gestures and quiet habits of an entire legion, each warrior adding his own small thread to a tapestry woven first by the Primarch himself. It is little wonder that the Lunarwolves, shaped in this manner, developed a cohesion that few other legions of the Crusade could ever quite match, bound together not merely by orders, but by a shared understanding passed quietly from one generation of warriors to the next. It was during these years that Horus earned the title by which the galaxy would come to remember him most fondly. Lupercal. A name that spread first among his own warriors before traveling outward across the wider Imperium, carried by the same fierce loyalty that defined his legion. The title reinforced something that was already becoming true in the hearts of those who served him, that here was a Primarch whose legend was growing to match, and perhaps even exceed, the legends of his brothers. By the time that name had settled fully into common use, Horus Lupercal had become, in the truest sense, the defining identity of the Lunarwolves themselves, inseparable from the legion he had shaped so completely in his own image. The name itself carried echoes of an old and half-forgotten meaning, tied to ancient rites of protection and fierce, fraternal loyalty, and it suited him in ways that few titles ever suit the one who carries them. To his warriors, calling him Lupercal was not simply the use of an honorific, but an act of belonging, a small reminder that they themselves stood among the favored, the trusted, the chosen company of a Primarch whose star burned brighter than almost any other. By the closing years of this period, to speak of the Lunarwolves was, in nearly every meaningful sense, to speak of Horus himself, so completely had the warrior become indistinguishable from the warband he had built from nothing, into one of the most feared and most admired forces in the entire Imperium. Let this image rest a while longer in the quiet of your thoughts, before the story moves onward. A legion forged from a single hard world, bound together by shared origin and shared trust, marching always beneath the banner of a Primarch who asked nothing of his warriors that he had not already proven himself willing to give. The Lunarwolves at this stage of their long history were not yet the instrument of betrayal that later chapters would make of them. They were, instead, simply the truest expression of everything Horus had become, a fierce and devoted family forged in his own image, carrying his name proudly across the stars. The greatest of the Primarchs. Among 20 brothers each crafted to be extraordinary, it is no small thing to be remembered, again and again, as the greatest of them all. And yet this is precisely how history has so often chosen to remember Horus. Not simply as a gifted commander among many gifted commanders, but as something rarer still, the Primarch whose presence seemed to fill a room before he had even spoken a word. Of all his brothers, it was Horus who was most widely regarded as the most charismatic, the one whose mere bearing could calm a fractious council or steady an army on the edge of doubt. This charisma was not learned, nor practiced, in the way a courtier might practice a pleasing manner. It seemed instead to be woven into the very fabric of who he was, an effortless warmth that drew others toward him almost without their realizing it had happened. It is worth remembering, too, that such judgments rarely come easily among beings as proud and as accomplished as the Primarchs. To be named the greatest among 20 extraordinary brothers requires more than simple talent. It requires a kind of consensus, freely given by those who themselves had little reason to flatter one another, and every reason to measure greatness honestly against their own considerable achievements. That such a consensus formed so readily around Horus speaks to just how thoroughly he had earned it. It is worth pausing here, in the slow drift of this thought, to consider what such charisma actually meant in practice, across a galaxy as vast and as varied as the one the Emperor sought to unite. Soldiers from 100 different worlds, speaking different dialects and carrying different customs, somehow found themselves drawn toward the same easy confidence whenever Horus walked among them. Courtiers and commanders who might otherwise have remained cold and formal in his presence found themselves, almost despite their own caution, warming to him within the span of a single conversation. This was not a trick of speech, nor a calculated performance. It was simply the way he carried himself, present and attentive in a manner few leaders of his stature ever bothered to offer. Charisma alone, however, would not have been enough to earn him the reputation he carried across the stars. Horus possessed, in addition, a rare and rather startling breadth of talent, excelling not merely as a soldier but as a strategist, capable of shaping entire campaigns, a commander trusted absolutely by those beneath him, a diplomat skilled enough to settle disputes that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed, and a politician shrewd enough to navigate the delicate currents of the Emperor's growing Imperium. Where many gifted men excel in a single discipline and remain merely competent in others, Horus seemed equally at home in each of these roles, moving between them as easily as a man might move between rooms in a familiar house. So many great figures across history excel brilliantly in one single domain while remaining merely adequate elsewhere. Horus offered something different entirely, a rare completeness of talent that left very few situations in which he did not, in some fashion, hold the advantage. Consider how rare such breadth truly is, even among beings designed for greatness. A brilliant general is not always a patient diplomat. A skilled negotiator is not always a decisive commander in the heat of battle. Yet Horus carried all of these talents at once, switching between them with a fluency that seemed to cost him nothing, as though the requirements of warfare and the requirements of statecraft were, to his mind, simply two dialects of the very same language. Those who served closely beneath him often remarked that he never seemed rushed nor uncertain, whatever the demands of the moment, moving from a war council to a diplomatic audience within the same afternoon without ever losing the thread of either task. It was this very breadth that led so many to consider him the most versatile of all the Primarchs, a distinction quite separate from simple strength or skill at arms. Some of his brothers were unmatched on the battlefield, yet awkward or impatient in matters requiring subtlety and restraint. Others excelled in counsel and negotiation, yet lacked the fire needed to inspire warriors into battle. Horus alone seemed to move fluidly across this entire spectrum, equally capable of leading a devastating shock assault and of sitting calmly across a negotiating table from a wary and reluctant world, achieving in either case the outcome his father required of him. This versatility carried with it a particular kind of authority that proved difficult for others to dispute. When Horus spoke of strategy, hardened generals listened, for they knew his counsel came not from theory alone but from countless hours spent at the very heart of battle. When he spoke of negotiation, wary diplomats listened too, for they understood that his words carried the weight of genuine experience rather than borrowed wisdom. There was no single arena in which his judgment could easily be dismissed, and this, perhaps more than any other quality, was what made him so consistently effective across the bewildering range of challenges the Great Crusade continued to set before him. Central to this versatility was an unusually sharp insight into the character of those around him. Horus could assess, often within moments of an encounter, the strengths an opponent relied upon, the weaknesses they sought to hide, and the deeper motivations that drove their resistance in the first place. This was not idle observation. It was a tool, deliberately honed, that allowed him to tailor his approach to whatever situation he faced, offering strength where strength was required, and patience where patience would serve him better. Few commanders in the history of the Crusade could read an opponent so quickly, nor turn that reading to such immediate and practical advantage. This particular gift traced its roots, perhaps, all the way back to the underhive of Cthonia, where reading the intentions of others quickly and accurately had once been a simple matter of survival. A misjudged alliance, a misread threat, could cost a life in those early years, and Horus had learned, long before he ever wore the title of Primarch, to watch carefully for the small signs that revealed what a person truly wanted, rather than what they merely claimed to want. This same watchfulness, carried forward and sharpened across decades of campaigning, became one of his most formidable weapons, allowing him to diffuse threats that others might have missed entirely, and to find leverage in places where lesser commanders saw only a closed door. This deep understanding of psychology proved just as valuable away from the battlefield as upon it. In negotiation, Horus seemed to know instinctively which words might ease a fearful world toward compliance, and which threats, left carefully unspoken, would achieve more than any direct ultimatum ever could. In war, this same understanding allowed him to anticipate an enemy's next move before they themselves had fully decided upon it. It was a rare gift, this ability to move comfortably between the language of violence and the language of persuasion, and Horus wielded it with a fluency that few others could match. There is a particular kind of patience required to use such insight well, a willingness to wait, to listen, to let an opponent reveal themselves fully before acting. Many commanders, gifted though they were, preferred the simpler certainty of force, applying pressure until resistance broke, rather than searching for the quieter path that might achieve the same end without bloodshed. Horus, by contrast, seemed genuinely curious about the people he encountered, weighing their fears and their pride with the same careful attention he gave to enemy fortifications or troop movements. It was this curiosity, as much as any tactical brilliance, that made his particular gift for psychology so consistently effective. Indeed, where many of his brothers turned first to conquest, Horus frequently chose a different path when one was available to him, seeking compliance through diplomacy whenever such an approach better served the emperor's wider goals. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that a world won through negotiation often proved a stronger and more willing addition to the Imperium than one won purely through force, its people more readily integrated, its resources more readily offered, its loyalty more readily earned rather than merely extracted at the point of a blade. This was not weakness, nor reluctance to fight when fighting was required. The Lunar Wolves remained, throughout this entire period, one of the most feared forces in the Imperium, and Horus himself never shied from battle when battle was the only sensible course. Rather, his preference for diplomacy reflected a deeper pragmatism, an understanding that the true measure of the Great Crusade lay not simply in worlds conquered, but in an imperium that could endure long after the fighting had ended. A subdued population, resentful and merely waiting for the chance to rebel, served his father's vision far less well than a population that had chosen, of its own will, to take its place within the growing imperium. This same charisma that won over weary worlds also won over those who lived and fought alongside him. Soldiers spoke of him with open admiration. Civilians, upon worlds newly brought into the Imperium, often came to regard him with something closer to reverence than fear. And even among his fellow Primarchs, proud and formidable as each of them were in their own right, there were few who did not, in some measure, hold Horus in particular esteem. He had a way of making rivals feel heard, and allies feel valued, that few others among his brothers ever quite managed to achieve. It is rare enough for a single being to be loved equally by the soldiers who serve beneath him, the civilians whose worlds he conquers, and the proud, often quarrelsome brothers who stand as his equals. Each of these groups asks something different of the one who would win their favor. Soldiers want competence and courage. Civilians want fairness and mercy. Brothers, proudest of all, want respect freely given rather than grudgingly offered. Horus, somehow, seemed able to provide each of these things without diminishing any of the others, a balancing act that few in the entire history of the Imperium ever managed to sustain across so many years and so many worlds. It was for this reason that his reputation, by the time the Great Crusade had reached its height, rested upon something far broader than military victory alone. Many commanders win wars. Far fewer manage to unite the people they conquer into something resembling genuine loyalty. Horus achieved both, time and again, across countless worlds and countless campaigns, and it was this rarer talent for unity, rather than simple conquest, that set him apart even among brothers who were themselves extraordinary by any measure. History remembers conquerors easily enough, their victories recorded in lists of worlds taken and enemies defeated. It remembers unifiers far less often, for unity leaves a quieter mark, visible not in a single decisive battle but in the slow, steady absence of rebellion across the years that follow a conquest. By this quieter measure, Horus's true legacy during these bright years of the Crusade may have exceeded even his most celebrated military victories. Worlds he brought into the Imperium tended to remain settled and productive, long after his legion had moved on to other campaigns, a testament to the genuine loyalty he had managed to cultivate rather than merely enforce. There is a particular kind of patience required to build loyalty of this quieter, more lasting sort, a willingness to invest in relationships that may take years to bear fruit, rather than seeking the immediate satisfaction of total subjugation. Horus seemed to understand this instinctively, perhaps drawing once more upon those distant lessons learned in the underhive of Cthonia, where alliances built carelessly rarely survived the season, while loyalty earned through genuine respect could endure for a lifetime. He brought this same patience to bear across 1,000 worlds, and the Imperium, in those bright years, reaped the benefit of every quiet investment he had made. In the years before the great tragedy that would later come to bear his name, Horus stood, in the eyes of nearly the entire Imperium, as the very embodiment of everything the Great Crusade was meant to represent. Loyalty given freely. Strength tempered by wisdom. Ambition placed always in service of something greater than oneself. It is worth resting on this image for a long moment, before the story moves any further forward. Whatever came later, however dark the chapters still to come, there was a time, real and well attested, when Horus Lupercal stood as the brightest example of all that his father had hoped his sons might become. If you had stood among the crowds gathered to watch his legion pass through some newly conquered city, in those bright early years, you would have seen a figure who seemed to carry the very ideals of the crusade made flesh. Children were said to call out his name. Veterans of 100 campaigns spoke of him as though describing something closer to a living legend than a mortal commander. And his brothers, when pressed, would often admit, sometimes with quiet envy and sometimes with genuine warmth, that if any one of them was destined to stand closest to their father's throne, it was Horus who deserved that place most of all. The Emperor's favored son. Among 20 sons, each striving in his own way to honor the vision their father had set before them, there is a particular weight that comes with being singled out above the rest. And Horus, by nearly every account that survives from this era, carried that weight more visibly than any of his brothers. He was widely seen, across the breadth of the Imperium, as the Emperor's favored son, a distinction that was rarely spoken aloud in such plain terms, yet was understood, quietly and completely, by nearly everyone who observed the two of them together. It was there in the way the Emperor's gaze seemed to settle on him a moment longer than it settled on others. It was there in the particular trust extended to him in council, and in the freedom he was given to act according to his own judgment, where other Primarchs were held to closer scrutiny. It is worth remembering that favor of this kind is rarely simple, even when it is well deserved. To be singled out among 20 proud and gifted brothers invites both admiration and quiet envy in equal measure, and Horus carried this particular distinction for many long years without it ever curdling into outright resentment among his siblings. That alone speaks to a delicate balance he managed to strike, beloved by his father without becoming despised by his brothers, a balance few in his position could have sustained for so long. Such favor is rarely announced through formal decree. It reveals itself instead in countless small gestures, accumulated slowly across years of shared history. A task entrusted without need for lengthy explanation. A disagreement met with patient discussion rather than swift correction. Those who attended the great councils of the early Imperium often remarked, long afterward, that the Emperor seemed to relax, however briefly, whenever Horus entered a room, as though some portion of the burden he carried could, for a moment, be set down and shared with someone he trusted absolutely. It was a small thing, easily missed by those not paying close attention, yet it spoke volumes to anyone who knew what to look for. This favor rested upon a relationship that had grown, across many long years, into something closer than almost any other bond shared between the Emperor and his many sons. Where some Primarchs maintained a respectful distance from their father, shaped by formality and duty rather than warmth, Horus and the Emperor shared something that felt, by comparison, almost familial. They had campaigned together. They had planned together, late into long nights, over star charts and reports from distant worlds. There existed between them an ease of communication that seemed to require few words, the kind of understanding that often only develops between two people who have spent a great many years working closely, side by side, toward the very same purpose. This is, perhaps, the rarest gift that those long years of campaigning together had given them both. Most of the Primarchs came to know their father only after they had already grown into the commanders they were destined to become, meeting him as fully formed beings rather than as children shaped under his direct guidance. Horus alone, among nearly all his brothers, had been granted the chance to learn at his father's side across the most formative years of the Crusade itself, absorbing not merely his strategy but something closer to his very temperament, until the line between teacher and student grew pleasantly difficult to locate. Given this closeness, it was perhaps inevitable that Horus would come to serve a purpose beyond the merely personal. He became, whether by deliberate design or simply through the natural course of events, a political symbol of everything the Imperium hoped to represent. Wherever his legion marched, wherever his banner was raised over some newly conquered world, the message carried with it was unmistakable, that here was imperial unity made visible, imperial expansion given a face and a name that ordinary people could understand and, in time, come to trust. Other commanders enforced the Emperor's will. Horus, by his very presence, seemed to embody it. This symbolic role carried its own particular burden, one that grew heavier with every world brought into the fold. A symbol cannot afford the small failures or private doubts that any ordinary commander might be permitted. Every action Horus took, every decision he made in council or upon the battlefield, was read by a watching Imperium as a reflection of the Emperor's own intentions. It was a great deal to ask of any single being, however gifted, and yet Horus seemed, throughout these years, to carry that weight with a lightness that made the burden almost invisible to those who watched him from a distance. It is worth pausing here, to imagine what such a burden might have felt like from the inside, however lightly it appeared to those watching from a distance. To know that one's every word and every gesture might be read as a reflection of something far larger than oneself is no small thing to carry, even for a being as capable as Horus. Perhaps it was this very weight, carried so quietly and for so long, that made the cracks which would later appear within him all the more difficult for others to notice in time. A burden borne with grace can still, in the end, prove heavier than it ever appeared from the outside looking in. This symbolic weight translated, naturally enough, into a particular kind of authority among his brothers. Though all 20 Primarchs stood formally as equals, bound by the same loyalty to the same father, there existed, in practice, a quiet hierarchy shaped by influence and respect rather than by any formal decree. Within this unspoken arrangement, Horus consistently found himself placed first among equals, his counsel sought more readily, his presence at councils treated with a particular deference that even his most accomplished brothers rarely commanded in quite the same measure. It was not a title he claimed for himself, yet it was a position the wider Imperium, and his own brothers, seemed willing enough to grant him. This arrangement suited a galaxy still finding its footing rather well. 20 equally proud voices, each certain of their own correctness, might easily have descended into endless rivalry and competing ambition. Having one voice that the others were generally willing to defer to, at least in matters touching the wider crusade, lent a stability to Primarch councils that might otherwise have proven difficult to maintain. Ullanor and the Warmaster. Across the long centuries of the Great Crusade, Horus led his legion through victory after victory, each campaign adding further weight to a reputation that already towered above nearly all his brothers. There were worlds brought swiftly to compliance through the sheer overwhelming force of his arrival, and worlds won through patient negotiation when negotiation served the purpose better. By the time the Crusade had reached its greatest extent, the list of triumphs attributed to Horus and his Lunarwolves had grown so long that few among the Imperium's many commanders could claim a record to rival it. Yet even among so many victories, one campaign would come, in time, to eclipse all the rest. There is a particular kind of weariness that can settle over even the most celebrated of commanders after so many centuries of unbroken campaigning, a weariness Horus seemed, outwardly at least, never to show. Whatever toll these endless years of warfare took upon him privately, he carried it well enough that those around him saw only the steady, confident leader they had always known, never the accumulating weight of decade after decade, spent at the very forefront of his father's great endeavor. It is worth pausing, for a moment, on the sheer accumulation of these years. Each victory, taken alone, might have been remembered as a notable achievement in its own right, the kind of campaign that other commanders spent entire careers attempting to match. Yet for Horus, such triumphs arrived with a regularity that began to seem almost ordinary. Each new world added to the tally with the same quiet competence that had marked his very first campaigns alongside his father. It was this steady, unbroken record of success that had built, over so many years, the towering reputation he now carried into the campaign that awaited him. That campaign was Ullanor, a conflict that would be remembered, long after the dust of battle had settled, as the single greatest triumph of the entire Great Crusade. The details of that distant war have grown hazy with the passage of so many years, fragments preserved in scattered records rather than any single complete account, yet the scale of what was achieved there has never been seriously disputed. It was a victory vast enough, and decisive enough, to draw the Emperor himself away from the wider business of governing his growing Imperium, so that he might witness, in person, the full measure of what his favored son had accomplished. Let yourself imagine, for a moment, the scale of triumph required to draw a being as occupied as the Emperor away from the countless demands of an entire growing Imperium. Whatever precisely transpired upon that distant world, it must have been extraordinary indeed, a victory so complete that witnessing it firsthand seemed worth setting aside, however briefly, every other concern. Such a journey was no small matter. The Emperor's presence was required across countless pressing concerns throughout the breadth of the Imperium, and he did not travel lightly, nor without purpose, to witness ordinary campaigns, however successful. That he chose to set aside these other duties and travel to Ullanor himself, speaks to the sheer magnitude of what awaited him there. Whatever the precise scale of the forces involved, whatever the exact nature of the enemy finally subdued, the campaign had clearly grown into something the Emperor judged worthy of his own personal attention, a rare honor bestowed upon very few moments across the entire history of the Crusade. Ullanor did not simply add another world to the long tally of imperial conquests. It became something closer to a legend in its own right, spoken of in hushed and reverent tones by soldiers who had fought there, and by countless others who had only heard the story secondhand. It stood, and continues to stand in the records that survive, as one of the defining achievements of the entire Crusade, a single campaign so complete in its success that it seemed, for a brief moment, to capture everything the Imperium had been striving toward since its very first tentative steps out into the stars. Whatever else might be said of Horus, in later, darker chapters of his story, Ullanor remained undeniable proof of what he had once been capable of achieving in his father's name. It was in the aftermath of this singular victory that the Emperor made a decision that would alter the entire structure of the Imperium's war effort. Horus was elevated, before the assembled might of his own triumphant army, to the rank of Warmaster, a title that had never before been granted to any other being in the long history of the Crusade. It was not a rank created lightly, nor handed out as simple reward for a single victory, however impressive. It represented something closer to a formal acknowledgement of everything Horus had already shown himself to be, across so many years of campaigning, the natural and inevitable culmination of a trust built slowly, battle by battle, council by council, since that very first meeting on Cthonia so long before. Picture, if you can, the scene of that elevation, however dimly it survives in the records passed down to us. An entire army assembled upon the field of its own victory, weary still from battle, watching as their Primarch knelt once more before his father, just as he had knelt so long ago upon Cthonia, though the distance traveled between those two moments could scarcely be measured in mere years alone. Whatever words the Emperor spoke in that moment, the meaning behind them was unmistakable to every soldier who witnessed it. Here, at last, was a title fit for the son who had proven himself, time and again, the truest reflection of everything the Crusade had set out to achieve. As Warmaster, Horus now stood as supreme commander of the entire Great Crusade, a position unlike anything held by any other Primarch before or since. Where once he had commanded only the warriors of his own legion, he now held authority that stretched across the combined might of the Imperium's military forces, every legion and every fleet ultimately answerable, in matters of the wider crusade, to his judgment and his command. It was an almost unimaginable concentration of military power, placed in the hands of a single being, however trusted, however beloved, however proven across so many years of unwavering loyalty. There is a particular kind of weight that settles upon a being granted such authority, a weight quite different from the burden of commanding a single legion, however large. Every decision now carried consequences across the entire breadth of the crusade rather than a single campaign. Every misjudgment risked far more than the lives of his own warriors alone. It is difficult, even now, to imagine the sheer scale of responsibility that settled upon Horus's shoulders in the days following his elevation, a burden that few beings in the history of the Imperium have ever been asked to carry, and fewer still have carried with the apparent ease that Horus, at least in those early days, seemed to manage. This new authority extended far beyond the simple command of his own Lunarwolves. Horus now bore responsibility for coordinating the efforts of his many brothers and their own legions, weaving together campaigns that spanned the entire breadth of the galaxy into something resembling a single, coherent strategy. It was a role that demanded not merely military skill, though Horus possessed that in abundance, but also the very diplomatic and political talents that had already set him apart from his brothers. He needed to manage proud and powerful Primarchs, each accustomed to commanding without question within their own domains, and somehow weld their combined efforts into a unified whole. It is worth considering, for a moment, just how delicate such a balancing act truly was. Each of his brothers had spent centuries building legions in their own particular image, developing doctrines and cultures shaped entirely by their own temperament and experience. To coordinate such proud and varied forces required something beyond simple command, a willingness to listen as much as to direct, to persuade as much as to order. Horus moved through this delicate work with the same ease he had shown in every other arena across his long career, and for a time, the entire machinery of the Crusade seemed to run more smoothly under his unifying hand than it ever had before. The appointment to Warmaster represented, by nearly every measure available to us now, the very height of Horus's power and prestige within the Imperium he had given his entire life to building. He stood, at this moment, closer to his father than any other being in the galaxy, trusted with authority that no other son had ever been granted, beloved by soldiers and commanders alike, and celebrated as the architect of the single greatest victory the Crusade had yet achieved. It is worth resting on this image a final time, before the story turns toward darker chapters still to come. A son raised from the underhive of Cthonia, now standing as the supreme commander of an entire galaxy's conquest, trusted absolutely by the very being who had created him. Whatever shadows lay ahead, this moment, at least, belonged entirely to triumph. There is something almost unbearably poignant in dwelling on this particular height, knowing as we do where the story eventually leads. For now though, let us simply allow this image to remain. A field still scarred from battle. A father and a son standing together before an entire army. A title spoken for the very first time, marking the absolute summit of everything Horus had worked so many years to become. The Sons of Horus. In the wake of such an extraordinary elevation, It seemed only fitting that the legion which had stood beside Horus through every triumph of his long career should be permitted to mark the occasion in a manner all their own. The Emperor granted his permission, and the 16th Legion, long known across the Imperium as the Lunar Wolves, took for themselves a new name. They would be known, from this moment forward, as the Sons of Horus, a title that bound Legion and Primarch together in a manner no mere banner or battle honor could ever quite achieve. There is a quiet ceremony worth imagining here, the moment when an entire legion first heard themselves addressed by this new name, a name that bound them more closely to their Primarch than any oath of allegiance ever could. Whatever pride filled that moment, however genuinely earned and however warmly received, it carried within it, unseen by anyone present, the first faint outline of a vulnerability that would not reveal its true shape for many years still to come. Few legions across the entire crusade were ever granted such a privilege, and fewer still chose to exercise it in quite so personal a fashion. Other Primarchs led legions named for ancient concepts, for fierce animals, for qualities their founders wished their warriors to embody. The Sons of Horus chose instead to name themselves directly for the being who led them, a decision that spoke as clearly as any battle honor to the particular nature of the bond shared between this legion and its Primarch. To name oneself after an ideal is to aspire toward something larger than any single being. To name oneself after a person is to bind one's identity entirely to that person's fate, whatever that fate might eventually become. This change of name was never intended as anything but an honor, a recognition freely given by the Emperor himself, in gratitude for service that had, time and again, exceeded even the considerable standards set for the other legions of the Crusade. It was meant to celebrate the extraordinary bond between Horus and his warriors, a bond that had already shaped the legion's culture so completely across the long years since its founding. There was nothing in this gesture that hinted, even faintly, at the darker turn such devotion might one day take. It was, in every visible sense, simply a father honoring a son, and a son's warriors honoring the leader who had given so much of himself to their cause. It is worth remembering, too, how thoroughly this gesture was celebrated across the legion at the time it was granted. Veterans who had fought beside Horus since the earliest campaigns on Cthonia spoke of the renaming with genuine pride, viewing it as the natural culmination of everything they had built together across so many years of shared hardship and shared victory. There was no shadow over this moment, no hint of the tragedy still waiting somewhere far ahead. It was, simply and completely, a celebration, the kind of honor a legion dreams of earning across an entire lifetime of service. Yet a name carries weight beyond simple ceremony, and in the years that followed, the identity of the legion grew steadily more inseparable from the Primarch whose name it now carried. Where once they had been the Lunar Wolves, drawing their character from a shared world and a shared culture, they were now, quite literally, the Sons of Horus, their very designation a daily reminder that their loyalty flowed first and most completely toward the being who led them, rather than toward any more abstract notion of legion or doctrine. Every new recruit who joined their ranks understood, from his very first day among them, exactly whose name he now carried, and exactly whose example he was expected to follow above all others. A legion's name is rarely a small thing, carried as it is into every battle and spoken in every report sent home across the stars. To carry a single being's name so completely is to be shaped by that name in ways no simple title ever could achieve. From this deepening identification grew something that, in hindsight, carried within it the seeds of genuine danger. A powerful cult of personality began to form around Horus, not through any deliberate effort on his part to cultivate such devotion, but simply through the natural accumulation of years spent earning the absolute trust and admiration of those who served beneath him. His warriors did not merely respect him as a commander. They revered him, spoke of him in tones reserved elsewhere for legend rather than for any living being, and measured their own worth increasingly by how closely they could match the example he had set before them. Such reverence rarely announces itself as anything dangerous while it is being built. It feels, from the inside, simply like loyalty, like the natural and well-earned devotion owed to a leader who has proven himself worthy of it 1,000 times over. Few among the sons of Horus would have described their feelings toward their Primarch as anything other than entirely appropriate, a fitting response to everything he had given them across so many years of shared campaigning. It was only later, when the consequences of such devotion finally revealed themselves, that the full weight of what had quietly taken root became impossible to ignore. Consider, for a moment, how naturally such devotion might have felt to an ordinary soldier within the Legion, surrounded daily by comrades who shared the very same feeling. There would have been no single moment of dramatic realization, no sudden awareness that something concerning had taken root. It would simply have felt like belonging, like being part of something larger and finer than oneself, the kind of feeling that any soldier might cherish without ever pausing to ask where its outer limits might eventually lie. This, perhaps, is precisely what made it so difficult to recognize from within, and so dangerous in the years still to come. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, in the quiet stillness of this thought. The very qualities that had made Horus such an extraordinary leader, his charisma, his closeness to his warriors, his willingness to share their hardships rather than rule from a comfortable distance, were the same qualities that now bound the sons of Horus to him with a devotion that went well beyond ordinary military discipline. Strength of loyalty, given so freely and so completely, can become its own kind of fragility, for it depends entirely upon the integrity of the one toward whom it is directed. Should that integrity ever waver, the very devotion that had once seemed the Legion's greatest strength might prove instead to be its gravest vulnerability. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly across the passing years, a subtle shift began to settle over the sons of Horus, one that few among them likely noticed even as it occurred. Loyalty to Horus himself, to his judgment, his vision, his particular understanding of what the Imperium ought to become, began to matter more, in the quiet hearts of his warriors, than any broader loyalty to the wider Imperium their father had built. It was a distinction that mattered little while Horus himself remained loyal to that same Imperium. But it was a distinction that would matter a very great deal indeed, should the day ever come when his own loyalties began to bend toward some different and far darker purpose entirely. A legion bound so completely to a single being that the line between serving the Imperium and simply serving Horus had grown almost impossible to distinguish. It is a dangerous thing, however understandable, for an army's loyalty to rest so entirely upon the character of one commander, however worthy that commander may seem in the bright light of victory after victory. The sons of Horus had built something extraordinary in their devotion, a bond stronger than almost any other shared between Legion and Primarch across the whole of the Crusade. Whether that bond would prove, in the end, a blessing or a curse, depended entirely upon the integrity of the man at its very center. The road to corruption. Beneath the long catalogue of triumphs and titles that had defined his life so far, there had always existed, hidden quietly beneath the surface, a more troubled inner landscape than the wider Imperium ever fully recognized. Horus, for all his charisma and all his brilliance, struggled in private with pride that occasionally outpaced even his considerable accomplishments, with insecurity that no amount of victory ever seemed entirely able to soothe, and with jealousy that flickered, every so often, toward brothers who seemed to receive recognition he privately felt belonged to him alone. These were not flaws visible to the soldiers who revered him, nor to the civilians who watched his legion pass with open admiration. They lived instead in the quieter spaces of his own mind, waiting, patiently, for circumstances that might one day draw them fully into the light. It is a sobering thing to consider how rarely such private struggles announce themselves before the moment they finally take hold. Horus walked among his warriors and stood before his father carrying these quiet doubts the entire time, masked so completely by his easy confidence, that almost no one around him suspected anything troubled lay beneath. Greatness, it seems, offers no immunity from the ordinary frailties that trouble lesser beings, only a greater skill perhaps, at keeping such frailties hidden from view. It was within his own legion that the first true avenues for outside influence began to take shape, hidden within structures that seemed, on the surface, entirely innocent. The warrior lodges, informal gatherings that had grown organically among the warriors of the 16th Legion, offered a space for camaraderie and quiet fellowship away from the more formal hierarchies of command. Yet these same lodges, precisely because they operated outside the usual channels of oversight, became fertile ground for influences that had no business taking root within an imperial legion at all. What began as simple brotherhood slowly became something far more dangerous, a quiet network through which outside voices could whisper unnoticed. Let yourself rest a moment on how ordinary such gatherings must have seemed at the time, soldiers seeking companionship away from the rigid structure of command, much as soldiers in any age have always sought such quiet fellowship. It is precisely this ordinariness that made the lodges so dangerous a vector, hidden in plain sight beneath the simple appearance of harmless camaraderie. Among those who recognized the potential of these lodges was Erebus, a figure whose patient and calculated manipulation would prove instrumental in the events that followed. Working carefully within the structures the lodges provided, Erebus moved with a subtlety that left little obvious trace, nudging circumstances and conversations in directions that served a purpose far darker than anyone around him could have suspected. He understood, with chilling clarity, exactly how such informal networks could be turned, slowly and carefully, toward ends that the wider legion would never have knowingly embraced. Let yourself rest a moment on the particular patience such manipulation required, a willingness to move slowly, almost imperceptibly, across years, rather than days. It is a quieter kind of danger than open conflict, and perhaps a more insidious one, for it leaves so little trace until its purpose has already been served. Erebus did not work entirely alone in this slow patient effort. Lorgar, too, played his own significant role in the broader scheme to draw Horus toward a very different path than the one he had walked so faithfully since his earliest days beneath the Emperor's banner. Where Erebus worked through quiet manipulation and careful positioning, Lorgar brought his own particular perspective, shaped by his own complicated relationship with questions of faith and devotion that the wider Imperium had largely chosen to ignore. Together, these influences began to weave a pattern that would, in time, prove devastating. It was on the world of Davin, however, that this slow accumulation of influence finally reached its true turning point. Whatever else might be said of the events that unfolded there, Davin has come to be remembered, across every account that survives, as the moment when the path Horus had walked his entire life first bent decisively toward something else entirely. It was here, far from the bright triumphs of Ulanor or the warm trust of his father's company, that the careful manipulations of those working against him finally found their opening. Through a ritual conducted upon that distant world, Horus was exposed directly to the corrupting touch of chaos, a force the wider Imperium understood only dimly, if at all, and certainly never expected to encounter so intimately within the body of one of the Emperor's own sons. The exact nature of this ritual remains shrouded in uncertainty even now, preserved only in fragments and contested accounts, yet its consequences proved undeniable. Something fundamental shifted within Horus upon that world, a corruption taking hold that would never again be fully undone. The ritual left more than an invisible mark upon him. Horus suffered, during these same events on Davin, a wound of devastating severity, one that permanently damaged one of his eyes and left him changed in a manner visible to anyone who looked upon him afterward. It was a wound that refused to heal in any ordinary sense, a physical scar that seemed, to those who later reflected upon it, to carry far deeper meaning than a simple battlefield injury ever could. There is something quietly unsettling in considering how the body so often carries forward what the mind would rather forget or conceal. An injury that refuses ordinary healing speaks of something deeper than torn flesh, something that medical skill alone could never fully address. Those who attended him in the aftermath of Davin spoke, in later years and often reluctantly, of a darkness that seemed to linger around that damaged eye, as though the wound itself remained a kind of open door, never quite closing, never quite allowing the body's natural defenses to seal it fully away. This injury became, in the years that followed, a lasting and unmistakable symbol of everything that had changed within him since that fateful day. Where once his bearing had radiated nothing but strength and easy confidence, there now lingered something else entirely, a visible reminder, carried in his very face, of the fate that had begun to reshape him from the inside out. Those who had known him before Davin sometimes struggled to reconcile the warrior they remembered with the figure who now stood before them, the same name and the same voice, yet carrying within him something the old Horus had never possessed. It was during this same dark and uncertain period that Horus became entangled too, with secrets surrounding the world of Molech, secrets that drew him further still into an understanding of the powers of chaos that no loyal son of the Emperor should ever have been permitted to acquire. What precisely transpired upon Molech remains, like so much of this period, obscured by conflicting accounts and deliberate secrecy. Yet it is clear enough, looking back across the whole of his story, that these were the years in which the foundations of his eventual betrayal were quietly, irrevocably laid, each event building upon the last, drawing him further from the bright and trusted son he had once been, and closer toward the tragedy that history would never forget. The Horus Heresy. What had been slowly, quietly accumulating beneath the surface for so many years finally broke fully into the open. Horus, the most trusted of all the Emperor's sons, the Warmaster who had once stood as the living embodiment of everything the Great Crusade hoped to achieve, turned at last against the very father who had raised him from the ashes of Cthonia and elevated him above all his brothers. It is difficult, even now, to rest comfortably on this single fact, so complete a reversal does it represent of everything that came before. Yet turn he did, and in turning, he set in motion a tragedy whose shadow would stretch across the rest of the Imperium's long and troubled history. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a story at the moment its course finally, irrevocably changes, and this was such a moment. Everything that came before, the bright triumphs, the deep trust, the quiet accumulation of doubt and corruption, all of it had been leading, whether anyone fully realized it or not, toward this single turning point. From here, the story could move in only one direction. This betrayal did not remain a private matter, nor a quiet falling away from duty conducted in secret. It ignited instead into open rebellion, a conflict that history would come to know as the Horus Heresy, a name that has echoed down through every account of this era ever since. What had once been the single most unified and ambitious endeavor in the history of the Imperium now fractured along lines no one could have predicted in the bright early years of the Crusade, brother turning against brother, legion turning against legion, in a civil war whose scale defies easy description. Let yourself rest a while on the sheer scale of what such a fracture meant for a galaxy that had known until then only the steady, confident expansion of the Great Crusade. Every world that had been won through unity now risked being lost through division, every alliance carefully built across centuries now tested by a single, devastating betrayal at its very center. Horus did not face this rebellion alone, nor did he build it through force alone. He turned, instead, to the very charisma and influence that had once made him so beloved across the Imperium, using these same gifts now to draw other Primarchs toward his cause. Where once his persuasive talents had won over wary worlds and rival commanders in service of his father's vision, they now served a far darker purpose, convincing brothers who had once stood beside him in loyal service to consider, and ultimately to accept, a very different path entirely. It is a measure of just how formidable his gifts truly were, that he succeeded in turning some of the very beings the Emperor himself had created to be beyond such manipulation. Let yourself rest a moment on the unsettling nature of this particular achievement. Beings created specifically to resist manipulation, shaped from their very inception to be exceptional in judgment as much as in strength, still found themselves drawn toward a cause that history would remember as the gravest treachery the Imperium had ever known. Several legions, swayed by the arguments and the personal bonds Horus had cultivated across so many years, chose to follow him into open rebellion against the Imperium they had sworn to serve. Each legion carried its own particular reasons for this choice, shaped by the unique grievances and temperaments of the Primarchs who led them, yet all found themselves drawn, eventually, into the same gathering storm that Horus had set in motion. The unity that had once defined the Great Crusade now became the very mechanism through which its undoing was achieved. The same bonds of trust and loyalty turned toward purposes the Emperor had never intended. It is worth dwelling, for a long moment, on how strange and how sorrowful this particular irony truly was. The very counsels and friendships that Horus had once used to strengthen the Imperium, weaving together brothers who might otherwise have remained distant and suspicious of one another, now served as the channels through which his rebellion spread most easily. Trust, once given freely between brothers, proved just as effective a conduit for treachery as it had once been for unity. Those who had once admired his gift for bringing others together now watched, in growing horror, as that very same gift carried half the Imperium's strength away into open war against itself. Horus's influence extended beyond the ranks of his fellow Primarchs and their legions. He worked, too, to draw the leadership of the Mechanicum into his growing rebellion, securing the support of those who commanded the vast technological resources upon which any war of this scale would inevitably depend. This was no small achievement, for the Mechanicum's loyalties had never been simply assumed by any single faction within the wider Imperium, and winning their support required the same patient political skill that had once served Horus so well in the diplomatic triumphs of his earlier years, now turned toward a purpose his father would never have sanctioned. At the very heart of this growing rebellion stood the vengeful spirit, the great flagship that became, in time, the command center of the entire traitor war effort. From its bridge, Horus coordinated the vast and sprawling campaign that would carry his rebellion across the breadth of the galaxy, directing fleets and armies with the same strategic brilliance he had once devoted entirely to his father's cause. The ship itself became, in the years that followed, almost as legendary as Horus himself, a floating symbol of the rebellion gathering beneath his banner, carrying him ever closer to the confrontation that both sides understood, with growing dread, had become unavoidable. Beneath that banner gathered forces of a scale and a nature that the Imperium had never before been forced to confront. Vast armies answered Horus's call, drawn from the legions that had pledged themselves to his cause, alongside renegades who saw in his rebellion an opportunity of their own, and demonic forces summoned forth from the very corruption that had first taken root within him upon Davin. It was an alliance unlike anything the galaxy had previously witnessed, mortal ambition intertwined with powers that existed entirely beyond the Imperium's understanding, all of it bent now toward a single, devastating purpose. And so the Imperium, which had spent so many centuries expanding outward in confident unity, found itself instead plunged into a civil war that spanned the entire galaxy, brother against brother, world against world, the bright promise of the Great Crusade consumed entirely by the fire of the rebellion that Horus himself had chosen, at last, to ignite. The Warmaster of Chaos. As his rebellion carried him further from the sun he had once been, Horus armed himself with weapons befitting the terrible new role he had chosen to embrace. He carried the Warmaster's talon, a weapon that had once symbolized his rightful authority over the entire Imperial war effort, now turned instead toward purposes his father had never sanctioned. Alongside it he wielded Worldbreaker, a mighty power maul whose very name suggested the scale of devastation it was capable of unleashing. Together, these weapons marked him as a warrior unlike any other across the breadth of the rebellion, instruments of destruction fit for the being who now commanded them. It is worth picturing, for a moment, what it might have meant to stand opposite such a figure upon some distant war-torn battlefield, watching as he advanced bearing weapons whose very names had once spoken of legitimate authority, now turned entirely to purposes of ruin. There could have been little comfort for any enemy facing him, knowing that the same hands which had once carried the Crusade's brightest victories now carried instead its gravest threat. There is a quiet irony worth noting in the names these weapons carried into battle. The Talon, once a mark of rightful command bestowed upon him by his own father in the bright aftermath of Ullanor, now served a cause that mocked everything that title had originally represented. And Worldbreaker, wielded in the hands of one who had once devoted his entire existence to building rather than breaking, to uniting worlds rather than shattering them, seemed almost to announce, with every crushing blow, exactly how far its bearer had traveled from the ideals he had once embodied so completely. Yet as the long terrible years of the heresy wore onward, it became clear that Horus had grown into something considerably beyond a conventional military leader, however formidable. He no longer simply commanded armies and directed fleets across the stars. He had become, through the corruption that had taken root within him since Davin, a figure whose very presence carried weight beyond the merely physical, a commander whose battles were no longer confined to the simple clash of arms that had once defined his glorious career during the Great Crusade. Let yourself rest a moment on the strangeness of such a transformation, a being who had once been simply, however extraordinary, a mortal commander, now grown into something that strained the very limits of what mortal language could adequately describe. Those who encountered him during this period, even briefly, often struggled afterward to put words to exactly what they had witnessed. It was not simply that he had grown stronger, though strength alone would have been remarkable enough in a being already counted among the mightiest in the galaxy. It was something stranger than mere strength, a sense that the very air around him had changed, that reality itself seemed to bend, however subtly, in deference to whatever now moved within him. Soldiers who had once found comfort in his presence now found instead something closer to dread, even among those who remained loyal to his cause. Let yourself rest a moment on this particular detail, perhaps the most quietly tragic of all. Even his own loyal warriors, who had once drawn comfort and confidence from simply standing near him, now found themselves troubled by a presence that had grown, in ways none of them could quite articulate, into something that unsettled rather than reassured. Some of the accounts that survive from this dark period describe him as fighting, in the heat of his greatest confrontations, on levels that stretched far beyond the physical alone. He contended, by these accounts, on psychic planes invisible to ordinary senses, and on spiritual battlegrounds where the very fate of souls hung in the balance, all of this occurring simultaneously alongside the more conventional warfare that raged around him. It is a difficult image to hold steadily in the mind, a single being waging war across so many planes of existence at once, yet it speaks to just how thoroughly the corruption within him had transformed not merely his ambitions, but the very nature of his power. Imagine, if you can, what such a battle might have looked like to those caught within it. Blades meeting blades upon some scarred and burning battlefield, while at the very same moment, unseen by mortal eyes, something far older and far stranger contended across realms that few among the living could ever fully perceive. Those who claimed to have glimpsed even fragments of this deeper struggle spoke of it only reluctantly, and in terms that strained the limits of ordinary language, as though the very attempt to describe it risked drawing the listener's attention toward something better left undisturbed. And yet, for all the terrible new abilities that had been granted to him through his fall, it was his oldest gift, his unmatched ability to manipulate, to inspire, and to dominate the minds and hearts of those around him, that remained his single greatest weapon throughout the entire heresy. The same charisma that had once won over weary worlds and rival commanders in service of the Great Crusade now served to bind traitor legions to his cause, to sway the uncertain toward rebellion, and to break the resolve of those who might otherwise have stood firm against him. Swords and demonic power alone could not have carried his rebellion as far as it traveled. It was the force of his personality, turned now toward darkness, that gave the entire uprising its terrible momentum. This is perhaps the single most unsettling truth at the very heart of his entire fall from grace. The demonic power, the terrible weapons, the corruption that had transformed him so completely since Davin, all of it remained, in the end, secondary to the same simple human gift that had once made him so beloved across the Imperium. Worlds did not fall to Horus because he overwhelmed them with sorcery alone. They fell because he understood still, exactly how to make rebellion feel inevitable, how to make resistance feel pointless, how to convince even the most loyal hearts that following him remained, somehow, the only sensible choice left available to them. There is a particular danger in a power that requires no overt cruelty to achieve its ends, a danger perhaps greater than any sword or any demon ever could pose on its own. A warlord who rules through fear alone eventually meets resistance, for fear, held too tightly, breeds its own quiet rebellion in time. But a warlord who rules through genuine belief, through the sincere conviction of those who follow him that their cause remains just and their leader worthy of trust, faces no such natural check upon his power. This, perhaps, is what made Horus so uniquely dangerous during these terrible years, that so many who served beneath his banner did so not from fear, but from a loyalty that had never quite recognized how thoroughly its object had changed. There is a tragic symmetry worth resting upon, in the quiet stillness of this thought, before the story moves toward its final, inevitable confrontation. Every quality that had once made Horus the Imperium's greatest champion, his charisma, his versatility, his unmatched ability to unite those around him toward a single shared purpose, remained present within him still, entirely unchanged in their fundamental nature. What had changed was only the purpose toward which these gifts were now directed. The very brilliance that had once built the Imperium's brightest triumphs had become, through betrayal and corruption, the instrument of its gravest and most dangerous threat, and there could be no greater tragedy in the whole of this long and sorrowful story than that simple, devastating truth. The final battle. Every rebellion, however vast, however terrible, must eventually arrive at some final reckoning, and for Horus, that reckoning could end nowhere else but at the very heart of the Imperium he had once served so faithfully. He led his vast and terrible armies in a direct assault upon terror itself, the sacred world of humanity's origin, the very throne world from which his father had once sent 20 sons out into the galaxy with such bright and hopeful purpose. There was a particular weight to this choice of target, a symbolism that needed no further explanation. To strike at terror was to strike at the very heart of everything the Crusade had built, and everything Horus himself had once devoted his entire existence to defending. Of all the worlds across the entire galaxy that Horus might have chosen to leave untouched, he chose instead to march directly upon the one world that had given him everything he had ever become. There could be no clearer signal, to anyone still watching from a distance, of exactly how completely his purpose had changed. There is something almost unbearable in imagining the long journey that carried him to this final destination. The same void he had crossed as a sleeping infant, carried unknowing toward Cthonia so many centuries before, now carried him once more, this time fully awake, fully aware, leading a fleet whose purpose was nothing less than the conquest of the very world that had created him. Every world he had once won for the Imperium through charm or through conquest now stood, in some sense, behind him, while ahead lay only terror, unmoving and unyielding, waiting for the confrontation that both father and son had perhaps always known, in some quiet corner of themselves, could never truly be avoided. The assault that followed has been remembered, across every account that survives, as one of the most devastating conflicts in the long and turbulent history of the Imperium. Armies clashed across a world that had known centuries of relative peace, the skies themselves darkened by the scale of the forces brought to bear on both sides. Yet for all the vastness of this conflict, for all the countless lives consumed within it, the true climax of the entire heresy would unfold not upon the battlefields of terror itself, but within the confines of a single vessel. It was aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the very flagship that had served as the command center of his entire rebellion, that the conflict finally reached its true and terrible culmination. Within those same corridors that had once carried orders to fleets spanning the galaxy, the final act of this long tragedy would play out, far from the wider battles still raging beyond the ship's hull. There is a certain grim-fitting symmetry in this, that the vessel which had carried Horus's ambitions so far across the stars should also become the setting for their ultimate undoing. Let yourself rest a moment on this particular symmetry, the same corridors that had once echoed with confident strategy now bearing witness instead to the rebellion's final, inevitable reckoning. There is something almost deliberate in how such stories so often return, in their final chapters, to the very places where their earliest ambitions first took root. There, within the Vengeful Spirit, Horus confronted his own father directly, in a duel that would come to define the entire age that followed it. Two beings of impossible power met at last in single combat, the Warmaster who had once been the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons now standing as his most dangerous enemy, while the Emperor himself, who had created Horus and elevated him above all his brothers, now faced the terrible necessity of ending what he had once made. Whatever words passed between them in those final moments, whatever grief or fury underlay the blows that were exchanged, the duel itself has come to stand as one of the most significant single moments in the entire history of the Imperium. It is worth resting, for a long moment, on the sheer weight of what such a confrontation must have meant for both participants. This was not simply two great powers meeting in battle, as so many other duels across the heresy had already played out upon 100 other worlds. This was father against son, creator against creation, the one being in the entire galaxy who had raised Horus from the underhive of Cthonia now forced to face the consequence of everything that had followed since that very first meeting so long ago. Whatever the Emperor felt in that moment, whatever Horus himself still recognized of the bond they had once shared, none of it could change what now had to happen between them. In the end, it was the Emperor who prevailed, striking down the son he had once trusted above all others. Horus, the Warmaster, the favored child of Cthonia who had risen to stand as the very embodiment of the Great Crusade's brightest ideals, fell at last beneath his own father's hand, the long, terrible arc of his betrayal finally brought to its inevitable conclusion. It was a victory bought at a cost few victories in history have ever demanded, the Emperor himself grievously wounded in the very act of ending the rebellion that had threatened to consume everything he had built. There is little triumph to be found in such an ending, however necessary it ultimately proved. A father had been forced to destroy the very son he had once loved above all his other children, the closest companion of his earliest years building the Imperium, the one being who had stood beside him when all his other sons remained lost somewhere among the stars. Whatever relief accompanied the rebellion's end, it arrived bound inseparably to a grief that the Emperor himself would carry for the remainder of his own long and troubled existence, an injury that, in its own way, never fully healed, even as the wider Imperium began the long, slow work of recovering from the devastation Horus had unleashed upon it. there is a particular sorrow in imagining what such a loss might have meant for a being who had already given so much of himself to the building of the Imperium. The Emperor had created 20 sons in the hope that they might carry his vision forward across the stars, and in Horus, he had found, for so many years, the truest and most trusted of them all. To lose such a son, not to distance or to the simple passage of time, but to a betrayal so complete that it ended only in death, must have carried a particular and lasting weight, one that no victory, however necessary, could ever fully ease. Yet even in death, Horus's fate proved different from that of so many others who had given themselves over to the powers of chaos before him. Where many servants of those dark powers find some manner of continuation beyond the simple ending of their mortal lives, drawn back across the years in forms twisted and strange, Horus was granted no such return. His soul itself was utterly destroyed in that final confrontation, consumed entirely rather than merely extinguished, ensuring that whatever he had become could never again rise to trouble the galaxy he had once sought to conquer. It was, perhaps, the only mercy left available in so dark and sorrowful a conclusion, a final and absolute ending to a story that had begun, so very long ago, with such bright and unblemished promise. Legacy. Though Horus himself was gone, destroyed utterly in that final confrontation aboard the vengeful spirit, the legion he had built, and the rebellion he had ignited, did not simply fade away alongside him. Abaddon, who had served as first captain of the Sons of Horus throughout the long years of the heresy, inherited a great deal of what his fallen Primarch left behind, including weapons that had once belonged to Horus himself, and a legacy of ambition and defiance that would carry forward across the millennia still to come. In Abaddon, something of Horus endured, transformed and carried onward by a successor determined to finish what his master had begun. It is a strange comfort, perhaps, to know that no story truly ends the moment its central figure falls. Threads continue onward, carried by those who remain, shaped by hands that were not the hands which first set events in motion. Horus's story closes here, in the quiet aftermath of his own destruction, yet the wider tale he set in motion continues still, carried forward across 10,000 years by those who came after him, for better and for worse alike. There is something fitting, in a quiet and sorrowful way, that a story so concerned with inheritance and legacy from its very first chapter should close upon another act of inheritance entirely. Just as Horus once inherited his father's trust and his father's vision, only to turn both toward ruin, so too would Abaddon inherit what remained of Horus, carrying it forward into ages that the Warmaster himself would never live to see. There is a particular weight in considering how such a legacy might pass from one being to another, weapons and purpose alike, carried forward by hands that had once served beside the one now gone. Abaddon had stood close to Horus throughout the long terrible years of the rebellion, watching the transformation that had carried his Primarch from beloved Warmaster to humanity's greatest traitor. Whatever he inherited in the aftermath of that final defeat, he carried forward not simply as relics of a fallen leader, but as a continuation of everything Horus had set in motion, a thread that would stretch onward across 10,000 years of imperial history, never quite severed, never quite resolved. Yet the deeper legacy of Horus's betrayal extended far beyond any single weapon or any single inheritor. His rebellion shattered, permanently and irrevocably, the unity that the Great Crusade had spent so many centuries so carefully building. Before Horus turned against his father, the Imperium had stood as a single, confident endeavor, expanding ever outward with the shared purpose of 20 Primarchs and their father, working in concert toward one common vision. After Horus, that unity could never again be fully restored. The galaxy he left behind was a fractured place, scarred by civil war, haunted by betrayal, forever changed by what had happened within those final, terrible years. Consider, for a moment, just how complete that earlier unity had once seemed, back in the bright years described so much earlier in this telling. 20 brothers, each extraordinary in his own right, working together beneath a single father's vision, expanding across the galaxy with a confidence that seemed, at the time, almost unshakable. Horus himself had stood as the very symbol of that unity, the bridge between his brothers and their father, the one being trusted by nearly everyone within the Imperium. That such a figure should become the very instrument through which this unity was finally broken lends his betrayal a particular and lasting cruelty, one that the Imperium would carry as a wound for every age still to come. It is for this reason that the Horus heresy has come to be remembered, across every account and every retelling, as the single defining event in the entire history of the Imperium. Other conflicts have come and gone across the long millennia since, other tragedies have unfolded across countless worlds, yet none have ever quite matched the heresy in terms of its lasting consequence. Every era that followed has, in some fashion, existed in its shadow, shaped by the lessons, the fears, and the lasting wounds that Horus's rebellion left etched into the very foundations of the Imperium. Scholars and chroniclers across 10,000 years of subsequent history have returned, again and again, to this single conflict, seeking within it explanations for nearly every subsequent crisis the Imperium has endured. The suspicion with which later generations regard their own commanders, the elaborate safeguards built into imperial institutions to prevent any single being from ever again accumulating such absolute trust and such absolute power, the very caution with which the Adeptus Terra now approaches questions of loyalty and faith, all of these trace their origins back to the lessons so painfully learned during those terrible years of civil war. What makes this legacy so particularly tragic is the transformation it represents within Horus himself. He who had once been the favored heir, the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, the brightest example of everything the Great Crusade hoped its champions might become, was remembered instead, in the centuries that followed, as the greatest traitor humanity had ever known. There is no figure in the entire history of the Imperium whose name carries quite the same weight of betrayal, no fall from grace remembered with quite the same mixture of sorrow and condemnation. The very completeness of his earlier glory only deepened the darkness of what he ultimately became. It is a peculiar quality of language itself, that his very name became, across the long centuries that followed, a word synonymous with betrayal in its purest and most absolute form. To call someone a new Horus, in the millennia since the heresy, carries a weight that few other comparisons could ever match, an accusation that reaches back across 10,000 years to the single most devastating betrayal the Imperium has ever endured. Few figures in any mythology, real or imagined, have left behind a name so thoroughly transformed by the manner of their fall. It is little wonder, then, that his story has endured as one of the greatest tragedies within the entire mythology of Warhammer 40,000. There is something timeless in the shape of his particular fall, a pattern recognizable across countless older stories of ambition, pride, and the slow corruption of even the most genuinely good intentions. Horus was never simply a villain from the very beginning of his tale. He was, for the greater part of his long and remarkable life, exactly what his father had hoped he might become, and it is this very fact that lends his eventual betrayal such enduring and haunting power. This is perhaps the deepest reason his story continues to resonate so powerfully, even now, across so many retellings and so many years. A simple villain offers little for reflection beyond straightforward condemnation. Horus offers something far more unsettling, a reminder that the very qualities we most admire in our heroes, charisma, ambition, the desire to be loved and trusted above all others, can become, under the right circumstances and the wrong influences, the very seeds of a downfall few could have predicted at the outset. His tragedy invites not simple judgment, but genuine reflection on how easily even the brightest among us might lose their way. The consequences of that betrayal continue to echo across the wider setting even now, long after the final battle aboard the vengeful Spirit. Much of the slow decline that has come to define the Imperium in the millennia since the heresy can be traced directly back to the wounds Horus's rebellion first opened. The fractured trust between Primarchs and their father, the wary suspicion that replaced the confident unity of the early Crusade, the sheer scale of loss the Imperium suffered in defeating his rebellion, all of these have shaped everything that followed, a long slow unwinding, that began in earnest the moment Horus first chose to turn against everything he had once so faithfully served. The Imperium that exists in the ages following the heresy bears little resemblance to the bright confident endeavor it had once been, during those early years of expansion and discovery. Where the Great Crusade had moved forward with hope and ambition, the Imperium that followed Horus's betrayal turned increasingly inward, governed by fear and suspicion rather than confidence, its institutions built as much to prevent another Horus as to advance any positive vision of the future. It is a melancholy thing to trace this long decline back to its single point of origin, yet the historical record leaves little room for any other conclusion. The wound Horus opened never fully closed, and the Imperium that survives into later ages carries that wound still, in every wary glance cast toward those who hold too much power, too much trust, too much love from those they are meant to serve. And yet, even within so dark a legacy, there remains something worth holding on to as this long telling draws toward its rest. The Imperium endured. Battered, fractured, forever changed by what Horus had done, it nonetheless continued onward across 10,000 years that followed, carrying forward whatever remained of the hope that had once defined the Great Crusade in its brightest days. Perhaps this too is part of his legacy, though a quieter and less often spoken part. That even the gravest betrayal, even the deepest injury inflicted by the one most trusted to protect against such things, need not mean the ending of everything that was built before it. The Imperium survived Horus, scarred but unbroken, and in that survival lies a small, hard-won comfort, amid so much sorrow. And so, at the very end of this long story, we are left with a single, quiet warning, carried forward across 10,000 years of Imperial history. Horus's rise and fall stand as a lasting reminder that even the greatest hero, however brilliant, however beloved, however thoroughly proven across countless years of loyal service, remains capable of becoming humanity's greatest enemy, given the right combination of pride, manipulation, and circumstance. It is a sobering thought to carry with you now, as this long telling finally draws to its close. Let it settle gently, without urgency, into the quiet of your thoughts, as you drift now toward rest, carrying with you the long and sorrowful tale of Horus Lupercal, once the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, and forever after, the most tragic. There is, perhaps, a strange kind of comfort to be found even within so sorrowful an ending, the comfort that comes from understanding rather than simple condemnation. Horus was not born a villain, nor did he set out, in those early bright years upon Cthonia, to become the architect of the galaxy's greatest tragedy. He was shaped, slowly and carefully, by forces both within himself and beyond his control, by pride that found fertile ground in genuine achievement, by manipulation that exploited bonds of genuine love and trust, by an injury upon a distant moon that opened a door he could never again fully shut. His story asks us not simply to condemn, but to understand, and in understanding, perhaps, to recognize the same fragile balance of greatness and vulnerability that exists within us all. Let the long night carry you gently now, as the story of the Lunar Wolves and their fallen Primarch finally comes, at last, to its rest.